our incarceration rates are unprecedented highs. So incarceration rates have consistently soared regardless of whether crime has gone up and down in individual communities or nationwide. So what does explain, this vast new system of control, if not crime rates? Well, it turns out those activists who post that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs has been the single greatest contributor to the mass incarceration of Black and brown people in the United States. Drug convictions accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. And for those who might imagine, like I once did, that the goal of the drug war has been to root out violent offenders or drug kingpins, no, not at all. Federal funding flows to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost dramatically the sheer volume, the sheer number of drug arrests, creating an incentive to fan out into poor communities of color and round up in mass as many low-level offenders as you possibly can. That's why there's stop and frisk operations going on in Chicago, New York, LA, where youth are stopped and frisked, their backpacks rifled apart while they're standing on the street corner waiting to catch the school bus. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession. Only 1 out of 5 for sales. Contrary to popular belief, most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the period of the greatest expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase was for marijuana possession, drug arrests for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and equally, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as in communities of color. The drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Despite studies that have shown for decades that people of color are no more likely to sell or use illegal drugs than whites, and in fact, white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than Black youth, this drug war has been aimed at rounding up in mass Black and brown youth, branding them as felons and criminals at early ages, thus relegating them to a permanent second-class status for life. Well, what we typically hear is that it's all about rates of drug crime. That drug crime is more likely to be found in ghetto communities. We were told back in the mid-1980s, early 1980s, that the reason that President Ronald Reagan was launching this war on drugs was to deal with rising drug crime. But the truth is, in 1982, when President Ronald Reagan officially announced his war on drugs, drug crime was on the decline. It went down. It was a few years before crack hit the streets, first in Los Angeles and later spread to communities of color across America. From the outset, the drug war had almost nothing to do with drugs. It was part of a grand and highly successful Republican Party strategy of using racially coded political appeals, these get-tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare, in order to appeal to poor and working class whites who were resentful of and disaffected by the gains of the civil rights movement. The history is clear. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Nixon's White House Chief of Staff, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." Well, a few years after the drug war was announced, crack cocaine hit the streets, in inner city communities, and the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff whose job was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, crack whores, in an effort to build public support for a drug war that had already been declared. Their goal was to make inner city drug use and violence a media sensation, bolstering public support and ensuring that Congress would devote millions of more dollars to it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug criminals. For nearly a decade, it was impossible to turn on the evening news without, seeing the scenes of black men in handcuffs and drug raids happening in housing projects. And Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove that they could be even tougher on them. In President Clinton's boastful words, President Clinton, who was supposedly our first black president, in President Clinton's words, he said, I can be nicked a lot, but no one can say I'm soft on crime. He made that statement standing outside of the execution of a mentally retarded black man while on the campaign trail in Arkansas. Clinton, though, wasn't satisfied with exploding prison populations. He and the so-called New Democrats, championed the legislation banning, drug felons from public housing, no matter, how minor the offense, denying them basic public benefits, including food stamps for life. Discrimination in virtually every aspect of political, economic, and social life is now perfectly legal once you've been branded a felon. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has gone along for the ride. The U.S. Supreme Court has, for the most part, turned a blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. People often ask me, if racial bias is so bad in the criminal justice system, why aren't there more lawsuits, against prosecutors and judges and the police? Why aren't there more lawsuits filed? We should just file some big class action lawsuits against all those who are engaging racial bias. If it's so bad, why isn't that happening? Well, as I describe in some detail in the book, the Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the Supreme Court has essentially said that no matter how overwhelming your statistical evidence, no matter how severe the racial disparities, unless you can present evidence of conscious, intentional racial bias, the kind of evidence that's virtually impossible to come by in the absence of an admission. Today when most everyone knows better than to say, I stopped him because he was black, or I sought the death penalty because he was black. Most officers, most prosecutors, most judges know better than to utter those words. And without evidence of conscious, intentional bias, courthouse doors are closed. You cannot even allege racial bias in the criminal justice system in the United States today. The U.S. Supreme Court has effectively immunized mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it rallied in defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their time. Now, I want to leave some time so we can have conversation and dialogue here. But I want to just identify a few of the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow. Jim Crow, of course, was a system of laws, rules, practices, and customs that operated to lock African Americans into a permanent second-class status. Well, consider some of the rules and laws and practices that apply to those branded felons and kind of ask yourself, these remind you of a bygone era. Well, first, denial of the right